I knew the call was bad before I even answered. You don't get 3 missed calls from your brother's school nurse in 5 minutes for nothing. I was stocking shelves in aisle 7 when my phone started buzzing in my back pocket, and I pulled it out to see Lincoln Elementary flashing across the screen for the 4th time. My manager Greg was already walking toward me from the front registers with that look on his face like he was about to lecture me about phone policy again, even though I'd been working there for 2 years without any problems. The store was basically empty because it was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday and nobody shops for discount furniture in the middle of a weekday, but Greg acted like we were slammed with Black Friday crowds or something. I answered the phone and stepped away from my cart full of decorative pillows, and the nurse's voice was all tight and professional, but I could hear something underneath it that made my stomach drop. She said my brother Danny had collapsed during recess and they'd called an ambulance and it was probably his heart condition acting up again, but this time seemed worse than usual and I needed to get to Children's Hospital right away. Danny was 8 years old and had this congenital heart thing that we'd been managing his whole life with medication and regular checkups, but every few months something would go wrong and we'd end up in the emergency room for a few hours while they stabilized him and adjusted his meds. Greg was standing right there when I hung up and I told him I needed to leave immediately because my little brother was being rushed to the hospital and his face didn't change at all. He just crossed his arms and said we were understaffed today because Marcus called in sick and I was scheduled until 9 and company policy required 4 hours notice for emergency leave unless it was a direct family member in critical condition with documentation. I stared at him for a second because Danny was my direct family member and this was obviously critical, but Greg was already shaking his head before I could say anything. He told me that siblings didn't count as immediate family according to the employee handbook and immediate family was only parents, spouse, or children, and that if I left without proper authorization it would be considered job abandonment and I'd be terminated effective immediately. My phone buzzed again and it was the hospital this time asking for insurance information and consent forms because they were prepping Danny for emergency procedures and needed a guardian present, and I told Greg this, but he just kept talking about policy and protocol like he was reading from a script. The thing is I wasn't just Danny's sister, I was his legal guardian because our mom had died 3 years ago from the same heart condition Danny had and our dad had taken off when I was 12 so it was just us. I'd gotten guardianship when I turned 18 6 months ago specifically so I could make medical decisions and sign consent forms and be there for stuff like this. I tried explaining this to Greg but he said the paperwork in my employee file still listed me as single with no dependents, so as far as the system was concerned I didn't have any immediate family members that would qualify for emergency leave. I started grabbing my jacket from the break room and Greg followed me saying that if I walked out that door I was done and he'd make sure I never worked retail in this district again because he had connections with all the hiring managers and they all checked references. He planted himself between me and the exit door with his arms crossed doing that power stance thing managers do when they think they're being authoritative. My phone kept buzzing with calls from the hospital and texts from Danny's school and I could see the notifications piling up but Greg wouldn't move. That's when Destiny from the cash register came over and told Greg she'd cover my shift and work a double if needed because she knew about Danny's heart condition from all the times I'd brought him into the store after school. Greg turned on her immediately and said if she didn't get back to her register he'd write her up for insubordination and she'd lose her Employee of the Month status that she'd been working toward for 6 months. Destiny looked at me with these apologetic eyes and went back to the front because she had 3 kids at home and couldn't risk losing this job. Greg pulled out his phone and called the district manager right there in front of me, explaining the situation like I was some problem employee trying to scam my way out of work. He kept saying things like unverified emergency and lack of proper documentation and potential fraud, while I stood there with my hands shaking trying to figure out what to do. The hospital called again and I answered it and the nurse said Danny was being prepped for an emergency cardiac catheterization and they needed my signature on consent forms within the next 20 minutes or they'd have to get a court order and that could delay treatment by hours. I told Greg this and he said that if it was really that serious the hospital would understand if I was delayed by a few hours finishing my shift and that I was being dramatic about the whole thing. He handed me his phone and the district manager backed him up, saying that without proper documentation of guardianship in my employee file there was no way to verify my emergency was legitimate and that I should have updated my paperwork when my family situation changed. I tried explaining that I'd submitted all the guardianship papers to HR 3 months ago, but they kept losing the forms and telling me to resubmit and I'd done it 4 times already, but nothing ever got processed. The district manager said that wasn't his problem and that Greg was following protocol correctly, and if I had an issue with the system I could file a formal complaint after my shift ended, but right now I needed to get back to work or accept termination. I hung up on him and tried to push past Greg, but he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and told me he was well within his rights to physically prevent me from abandoning my post during scheduled work hours. Marcus from electronics came around the corner and saw Greg holding my arm and told him to let go, and Greg did, but then threatened to fire Marcus too for interfering. Marcus didn't care though, because he was in his 60s and only worked there for the health insurance and wasn't scared of Greg the way the younger employees were. He told me to go and that he'd deal with Greg, and I started running for the door, but Greg called out that if I left he'd report my car as stolen company property because I'd parked in an employee spot, and those spots were considered company lease spaces during scheduled shifts. I stopped because my car had all of Danny's emergency medical information in the glove compartment, and I couldn't afford to have it impounded or towed while I was dealing with hospital stuff. Greg saw me hesitate and smiled like he'd won something and told me to get back to work, and we'd discuss my attitude problem after my shift ended. My phone rang again, and this time it was a doctor instead of a nurse, and his voice was different, more urgent, and he said Danny's condition had deteriorated and they needed to start the procedure immediately with or without consent forms, and could I please confirm verbally that I authorize treatment. I said yes, obviously, and the doctor asked me to verify Danny's full name and date of birth and medical history while Greg stood there tapping his foot like I was wasting his time. The doctor explained that Danny's heart was in arrhythmia and they needed to do an emergency ablation procedure, and there were risks, but without it he could have a full cardiac arrest within the hour. I could barely process what he was saying because Greg kept sighing loudly and checking his watch and making these annoyed faces like I was the problem here. When I hung up, I told Greg that my 8-year-old brother might die in the next hour if I wasn't there to sign consent forms, and Greg said that I was being manipulative and using emotional blackmail to get out of work, and that if the situation was really that dire the hospital wouldn't need my signature anyway. He pulled up the employee handbook on his phone and started reading the exact policy about emergency leave word for word, like that mattered more than Danny's life. Destiny came back over and said she'd called her mom to pick up her kids and she could definitely cover the rest of my shift, and Greg told her she was on thin ice and needed to back off. Then Taylor from the furniture department and James from receiving both said they'd help cover, and Greg threatened to fire all of them for coordinating what he called a work stoppage. He got on the store intercom and announced that anyone who left their assigned station to cover for me would be terminated immediately for violating the chain of command. The store had maybe 6 customers in it total, and they were all staring at this situation unfolding, and one older woman came up and asked Greg if he was seriously preventing someone from getting to their dying family member. Greg told her to mind her own business and continue shopping, and she said she was going to report this to corporate and take her business elsewhere, and Greg said that was her choice but didn't change anything about the current situation. My phone buzzed with a text from the hospital saying Danny was being taken into the procedure room and asking me to get there as soon as possible because he was asking for me and was scared. I showed the text to Greg and he barely glanced at it before saying that kids say they're scared about everything and it didn't constitute a medical emergency. He walked back toward his office and told me I had 5 seconds to return to my station, or I could clean out my locker and leave without severance or reference. Something in me just broke and I ran for the door, and Greg yelled after me that I was fired and he'd make sure I never worked anywhere in retail again, and he was reporting my car as stolen property. I made it to my car and saw a security guard walking toward me from the mall entrance and realized Greg must have called mall security to stop me from leaving. The guard asked me to step out of my vehicle, and I told him my brother was dying and I needed to go, and he said he'd received a report of potential vehicle theft and needed to verify my identification and registration. I showed him my driver's license and registration and employee badge and explained the whole situation while crying, and he looked uncomfortable but said he had to follow protocol and needed to call it in. He got on his radio and started describing the situation to his supervisor while I sat there watching the clock tick away minutes I didn't have. His supervisor eventually said to let me go but to write down my license plate number for the report, and the guard apologized and said he was just doing his job. I drove to the hospital going 20 over the speed limit the whole way and ran into the emergency entrance, and the woman at the desk took forever looking up Danny's information in the computer system. She kept asking me to spell his last name and verify his date of birth and insurance information like we had all the time in the world. Finally, she gave me a visitor badge and told me Danny was in the cardiac unit on the 4th floor, and I needed to take the east elevators because the west elevators were out of service. The elevators took forever, and when I got to the 4th floor, the nurse's station was empty, and I had to wander around looking for someone who could tell me which room Danny was in. I found a nurse who checked her tablet and said he was in procedure room C and pointed down a hallway, but when I got there the door was locked and had a sign saying authorized personnel only. I banged on the door and a different nurse came out looking annoyed and asked what I needed, and I said I was Danny's guardian and needed to sign consent forms. She told me the forms had already been signed by a court-appointed emergency guardian because I hadn't arrived in time and Danny was currently in the middle of the procedure and I couldn't go in there. I asked if he was okay, and she said she couldn't discuss patient information in the hallway, and I needed to go to the waiting room and someone would update me when the procedure was finished. The waiting room had these uncomfortable plastic chairs and a TV playing some cooking show and 3 other families waiting for news about their own people. I sat there for 2 hours before a doctor finally came out and called my name, and I jumped up so fast I knocked over the styrofoam cup of coffee I'd been holding. The doctor said Danny had made it through the procedure successfully, but it had been more complicated than expected, and they'd had to do additional interventions because his heart had actually stopped briefly on the table. He said if they'd waited even 30 more minutes to start the procedure, Danny probably wouldn't have made it. The doctor asked why I hadn't been there to sign the consent forms initially, and I tried explaining about my manager and the whole situation at work, but he cut me off and said that as Danny's legal guardian I had a responsibility to be available for medical emergencies regardless of my work situation. He made it sound like I'd chosen to stay at work instead of coming to the hospital, and I tried to explain again, but he was already walking away to check on other patients. I finally got to see Danny around 6 p.m. and he looked so small in that hospital bed with all the monitors and wires attached to him. He was awake but groggy, and when he saw me he started crying and asked where I'd been and why I didn't come sooner. I tried to explain, but how do you tell an 8-year-old that your manager wouldn't let you leave work to save his life? He just kept saying he was scared and asking for me, and the nurses told him I was coming, but I never showed up. The guilt of that sat in my chest like a weight, and I couldn't stop thinking about Danny being terrified and calling for me while Greg was lecturing me about employee handbooks and proper documentation. I stayed at the hospital that night sleeping in the chair next to Danny's bed, and every time he woke up confused and scared I was there to hold his hand, but it didn't erase the fact that I hadn't been there when he needed me most. The next morning my phone had 17 missed calls and a bunch of texts from my co-workers at the store. Destiny sent me screenshots of an email Greg had sent to the whole staff saying I'd been terminated for job abandonment and insubordination, and using a false emergency to leave work without authorization. The email said I'd been dishonest about my family situation and warned other employees about attempting similar manipulation tactics to avoid their work responsibilities. Marcus texted saying that Greg had fired him too for interfering with a disciplinary situation, and that 3 other employees had quit in protest, and the store was basically falling apart because nobody wanted to work for someone who'd prevent an employee from getting to their dying brother. He said corporate was getting flooded with calls from customers who'd witnessed what happened, and there was already a petition circulating to have Greg removed as manager. I tried not to think about any of it and just focused on Danny, who was stable but needed to stay in the hospital for at least a few more days for observation. The social worker came by and asked about my employment situation, and when I told her I'd just been fired, she got this concerned look and started asking questions about our living situation and financial stability. I explained that I'd been working full-time while taking classes part-time and that losing this job meant I couldn't afford rent next month and we might have to move again. She made some notes and said she was required to file a report about our situation because Danny's medical care required a stable living environment and the state needed to ensure his guardian could provide that. I asked what that meant, and she said it meant they'd be checking in regularly to make sure I could meet Danny's needs, and if not they might need to consider other arrangements. The idea that I could lose Danny because Greg wouldn't let me leave work made me feel physically sick. Danny's doctor came by later and explained that the procedure had been successful, but Danny would need to be on new medications and come in for follow-up appointments every 2 weeks, and eventually he'd need another more extensive surgery when he was a bit older and stronger. The costs started adding up in my head, and I didn't have health insurance anymore because I'd just been fired and Danny's insurance through the state only covered so much, and I had no idea how I was going to pay for any of this. I called my old roommate who still worked at the store, and she said the situation there had gotten completely insane. Multiple employees had walked out and customers were boycotting, and the mall management was investigating and corporate had sent someone down to assess the situation. Greg was apparently walking around acting like nothing was wrong and telling everyone I'd made the whole thing up and there was no emergency, and I just used my brother as an excuse to skip work. The corporate investigator called me that afternoon and asked for my side of the story, and I explained everything from the beginning, including all the times I'd submitted guardianship paperwork that never got processed. She asked if I had copies of the hospital records, and I said yes, and she said to send them over and they'd review the situation, but it could take several weeks to complete the investigation and reach a decision. I asked if that meant I could get my job back, and she said not necessarily because Greg had documented multiple policy violations on my part, including unauthorized phone use during work hours and abandoning my assigned station and leaving company property without permission. She said even if they determined Greg handled the situation poorly, it didn't change the fact that I'd technically violated company policy by leaving during a scheduled shift without proper authorization. The unfairness of it made me want to scream, but I kept my voice calm and professional and thanked her for her time and hung up. Danny was asleep in the hospital bed and his monitors were beeping steadily, and I sat there thinking about how none of this would have happened if Greg had just let me leave for 20 minutes to sign some forms. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and when I opened it there was a link to a Facebook post someone had made about the situation. The post had been shared 800 times and had hundreds of comments, and most of them were supportive, but some people were saying I should have handled it differently, or that I must have been a problem employee already for Greg to react like that. Someone had found Greg's personal Facebook profile and posted screenshots of him complaining about lazy employees and participation trophy culture, and how young people didn't understand work ethic anymore. The hospital social worker came back with more forms and started asking detailed questions about my income and expenses and Danny's care needs. She wanted to know if I had family support or anyone who could help if I couldn't work for a while, and I explained that we didn't have anyone else. Our mom's parents were dead and our dad was who knows where, and it was just me and Danny against the world basically. She made more notes and said she wasn't trying to make things harder, but they had to ensure Danny's welfare, and that if I couldn't demonstrate financial stability they might need to place him in temporary foster care while I got back on my feet. I asked how I was supposed to get back on my feet without a job, and she said there were resources and programs and she'd give me some information, but ultimately it was up to me to figure out a solution. 3 days later Danny was discharged with a huge stack of prescriptions and follow-up appointment cards and instructions for his care. The hospital billing department stopped me on the way out and asked about payment for the emergency procedure, and I told them I'd lost my insurance, and they said the total was $47,000 for the procedure plus the 3-day stay. They could set up a payment plan, but I'd need to make a minimum monthly payment of $800 starting next month. I drove Danny home to our apartment and he fell asleep immediately because he was still recovering and exhausted from everything. I sat on the couch with all the medical bills and prescription costs and tried to do the math, and no matter how I calculated it, we were completely screwed. The rent was due in 2 weeks and I didn't have it, and without a job I couldn't get another apartment if we got evicted, and the shelters in our area didn't take people with complex medical needs like Danny's. My phone rang and it was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered it was a lawyer named Patricia Chen, who said she'd heard about my situation through the Facebook post and wanted to know if I'd be interested in pursuing legal action against the store. She said what Greg did was potentially illegal and definitely unethical, and she thought we had a strong case for wrongful termination and emotional distress and possibly even medical endangerment. I told her I didn't have money for a lawyer, and she said she'd work on contingency, which meant she only got paid if we won and her fee would come out of any settlement or judgment we received. She wanted to meet that week to go over everything and collect documentation and start building a case. Part of me wanted justice and part of me just wanted to move on and forget the whole thing, but the bills sitting on my coffee table made the decision for me. The meeting with Patricia was in her small office above a Thai restaurant, and she had me walk through the entire day minute by minute while she recorded everything and took notes. She asked about my employment history and performance reviews and any previous issues with management, and I told her I'd been a good employee with no warnings or write-ups before this. She requested copies of all my medical records and Danny's medical records and the hospital timeline and my employee file from the store. She explained that cases like this could take months or even years to resolve, and that the company would fight back hard and try to make me look like a bad employee who was lying about the emergency. She said they'd probably dig into my personal life and bring up anything they could find to discredit me and make Greg look justified in his actions. I asked if it was worth it, and she said that depended on what I wanted out of it and whether I could handle the stress of a prolonged legal battle while caring for Danny. Meanwhile, I'd been applying to every job I could find, but nobody wanted to hire someone who'd been fired for job abandonment, even when I tried to explain the circumstances. Most places just saw the termination on my record and moved on to the next applicant. I was running out of savings fast and the rent deadline was approaching, and I still hadn't figured out what to do about Danny's medications, which cost $300 a month even with the state insurance. Marcus called me and said he'd filed his own complaint with the labor board about being fired for trying to help me, and that several other former employees were doing the same. He said the store was apparently in chaos with barely enough staff to stay open, and there were rumors corporate was considering shutting down that location entirely. He asked how Danny was doing, and I told him about the surgery and the medical bills, and he said he wished he could help, but he was living on his retirement pension and didn't have extra to spare. The Facebook post had grown into a full-blown social media campaign with people creating hashtags and calling for boycotts, and someone had even made a GoFundMe for Danny's medical expenses without asking me first. Patricia said the GoFundMe was actually good for our case because it showed community support and demonstrated that people believed my story, but I felt weird about strangers donating money to us because my manager had been cruel. 2 weeks after Danny got out of the hospital, I got an email from corporate's legal department with a settlement offer. They'd pay me $10,000 and agree not to contest my unemployment claim if I signed a non-disclosure agreement and agreed not to pursue further legal action or make any public statements about the incident. Patricia said it was an insulting lowball offer and we should counter with at least $100,000 plus medical expenses, but I was staring at an eviction notice that had just been taped to my door, and I wasn't sure I could afford to wait months for a better outcome. Danny's prescriptions were running low, and I'd already skipped filling 2 of them because I couldn't afford all of them at once, and the social worker had called twice asking about our housing situation. Patricia wanted to fight, but she wasn't the one who might lose custody of her brother or end up homeless. I asked her what she honestly thought our chances were if we went to court, and she said probably 60-40 in our favor, but trials were unpredictable and juries sometimes sided with employers even in clear-cut cases. The next follow-up appointment with Danny's cardiologist was rough because she noticed his medication levels were off and asked if he was taking everything as prescribed, and I had to admit I'd been rationing the expensive ones. She got this disappointed look and said Danny's recovery depended on consistent medication and that skipping doses could cause serious complications. She asked about my financial situation, and I broke down crying right there in the exam room while Danny sat on the table looking confused and scared. The doctor prescribed some generic alternatives that were cheaper and said she'd talk to the pharmaceutical company about assistance programs, but her tone made it clear she thought I wasn't managing Danny's care properly. On the drive home, Danny asked why the doctor seemed mad at me, and I tried to explain about money and jobs and how sometimes grown-ups have problems that are hard to fix. He got quiet and said he was sorry for having a broken heart, and I had to pull over because I was crying too hard to drive safely. Patricia called that night and said corporate had come back with a revised offer of $25,000 plus continuation of my health insurance for 6 months, but the NDA still stood and I'd have to agree to never discuss the case publicly. She said we could probably push for more, but time was a factor, and she understood if I needed to take it. I asked what she would do, and she said she'd fight, but she also didn't have an 8-year-old depending on her, and sometimes the practical choice wasn't the righteous one. I signed the settlement agreement on a Tuesday morning in Patricia's office and felt like I was betraying everyone who'd supported us by agreeing to stay quiet. The money hit my account 3 days later, and I immediately paid the back rent and Danny's medical bills and filled all his prescriptions and bought groceries for the first time in weeks. It felt good to not be drowning for a minute, but it also felt wrong somehow, like I'd let Greg win by taking their money and shutting up. The GoFundMe had raised $12,000 by the time the settlement came through, and I had Patricia help me set it up as a trust for Danny's future medical expenses since the settlement money would run out eventually, but he'd need care for the rest of his life. People had left hundreds of comments sharing their own stories of cruel managers and medical emergencies and thanking me for speaking out, even though the NDA meant I couldn't actually speak out anymore. Marcus texted that Greg had been quietly transferred to another store in a different district and promoted to regional trainer, which meant corporate had basically rewarded him for the whole situation. The store where it happened got a new manager and new employee handbook policies about medical emergencies, but nobody was fired and nobody faced real consequences except me and Marcus and the other employees who'd lost their jobs trying to help. 6 months later, Danny had his follow-up surgery, and it went well, and the insurance I'd kept from the settlement covered most of it, and the trust fund covered the rest. The social worker closed our case after determining our housing and financial situation were stable enough and Danny was getting proper medical care. I found a new job working remotely for an online company that let me set my own hours and be available when Danny needed me. I still think about that day sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, about those hours trapped in the store while Danny was alone and scared calling for me. The settlement money is almost gone now because medical expenses never really stop, and Danny will need more surgeries as he gets older. Greg is apparently doing fine in his new position and got some kind of company leadership award last quarter, according to a LinkedIn notification I got because we're still connected on there somehow. The NDA means I can't talk about what happened publicly, but it doesn't stop me from thinking about it or from seeing Greg's face every time Danny has a bad day with his heart or when I'm filling out medical forms in the middle of the night. The system protected him and punished everyone who tried to help, and that's just how it is apparently. Life continues and bills keep coming and Danny keeps growing and needing more care, and I keep doing my best even though my best wasn't good enough that one afternoon when it mattered most. Sometimes Danny still has nightmares about being in the hospital and calling for me, and I wonder if he remembers that I wasn't there in time or if he just remembers that I came eventually. I never asked because I don't want to know, and he doesn't bring it up, and we both just pretend that afternoon didn't shape everything that came after. The plaque by the store door that says "Excellence in Customer Service" is still there last time I drove by, and maybe that's all that matters to some people.